A single language family, born somewhere in a small patch of grassland straddling the modern border between Cameroon and Nigeria, would go on to become the mother tongue of roughly 1 in every 4 people living on the African continent today. Nobody planned it that way. No empire commissioned it, no single ruler ordered it, and for more than a century, researchers couldn't even agree on whether it had actually happened through migration at all, or whether it was simply an idea, a language, and a set of farming techniques that spread from village to village without any large-scale movement of actual people behind it. In 2023, a team of geneticists assembled the largest genomic dataset ever built, specifically to answer this question, sequencing new ancient DNA and comparing it against nearly 1,800 living participants spread across 14 countries. And what they found didn't just confirm one side of a century-old academic argument. It revealed something considerably stranger about how this expansion actually unfolded, a migration that broke almost every rule population geneticists thought governed how humans spread across new territory. To understand why this specific question sat unresolved for so long, you first have to understand the sheer scale of what's actually being explained here. Bantu-speaking populations today number somewhere around 350 million people, spread across roughly 9 million square kilometers of the African continent, speaking more than 500 distinct related languages, from Swahili along the East African coast to Zulu and Xhosa in South Africa, from Lingala in the Congo Basin to Kikuyu in Kenya. This represents, by any reasonable measure, one of the largest and most successful language family expansions in all of recorded human history. And yet, the entire linguistic family traces back to a single shared ancestral tongue that anthropologist Jared Diamond once described directly as the site of the greatest population movement in recent African history. The challenge facing researchers for well over a century was that shared language alone can't tell you whether it spread because large numbers of people physically moved and settled new territory, carrying their language, genes, and culture together as a package, or whether it spread the way many languages have spread throughout history, through trade, intermarriage, and cultural prestige, with local populations gradually adopting a new language without any large-scale replacement or migration of the people speaking it actually occurring at all. This distinction matters enormously for how historians and archaeologists understand the deeper story of the African continent. And it's precisely the kind of question that written records can't resolve on their own, because the Bantu expansion unfolded almost entirely within a period that predates any surviving written documentation from the region. Linguists working through the 20th century built an impressively detailed picture of the expansion using comparative reconstruction, tracing shared vocabulary and systematic sound changes across the hundreds of modern Bantu languages to build a rough family tree indicating both the likely point of origin and the general direction the expansion must have traveled. That linguistic reconstruction consistently pointed toward a homeland in the region straddling the modern border between Cameroon and Nigeria, with the expansion beginning somewhere between 6,000 and 4,000 years ago. But linguistic reconstruction alone, however sophisticated, could never fully settle the underlying question of whether people, not just words, actually moved. Archaeology added real, physical layers of evidence to this picture over subsequent decades, documenting the spread of specific pottery styles, iron smelting technology, and agricultural practices across sub-Saharan Africa in patterns that roughly tracked what the linguistic reconstruction had already proposed. In East Africa specifically, archaeologists identified the earliest Bantu-associated settlements in the Great Lakes region, appearing around 2,600 years before present, connected to a distinctive style of pottery known as the Uruwe tradition, itself associated with early iron smelting technology and established farming practices. Related pottery traditions, including the Kwale and Matola styles, appear at sites stretching along the coast from southern Kenya through Mozambique and into KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. And archaeologists have interpreted this pattern as evidence of an extremely rapid coastal dispersal of Bantu-speaking populations, potentially covering the distance from the Great Lakes region to South Africa in less than 2 centuries, an interpretation that has itself remained genuinely contested, since researchers studying this specific stretch of the migration have openly acknowledged that the connection between the Uruwe tradition further inland and the related pottery styles found along the coast remains unclear, and the exact historical events that carried this tradition into the interlacustrine region around Uganda are still not fully understood. Archaeology, in other words, like linguistics, could document that a specific technology or pottery style spread across a given region. It couldn't, on its own, prove definitively that the people making that pottery and farming that land had actually migrated there themselves, rather than simply adopting new tools and techniques from neighbors through ordinary trade and cultural contact. This is precisely the gap population genetics was uniquely positioned to close, because unlike pottery styles or vocabulary, DNA cannot spread from person to person without an actual person carrying it. If the Bantu expansion genuinely involved large-scale human migration, the genetic signature of that migration should be directly detectable and traceable across the modern populations descended from it. Early genetic research into this question, beginning in the 2000s, focused primarily on mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome markers, and found real, meaningful evidence supporting the migration hypothesis. A 2009 study published in the journal Molecular Biology and Evolution, analyzing Y chromosome data from 883 individuals across 22 Bantu-speaking agricultural populations and 3 pygmy hunter-gatherer populations in Gabon and Cameroon, found that the overwhelming majority of Bantu-speaking men across this enormous geographic range carried Y chromosome markers belonging to a single widespread haplogroup, generally labeled E3A in earlier literature, and now more commonly referred to as E1B1A or EM2, the exact same broad paternal lineage that has since been documented as the dominant Y chromosome haplogroup among Niger-Congo-speaking populations across West and Central Africa more broadly, including specifically among the Igbo people of Nigeria. The dominance of this single lineage across such an enormous, linguistically diverse population was itself a strong signal that actual paternal migration, not simply cultural transmission, had carried this specific genetic marker across the continent, effectively overrunning much of the pre-existing Y chromosome diversity that had characterized the region before the expansion began. That same 2009 research also identified a genuinely interesting nuance in the data, pointing toward what researchers described as a putative, sexually asymmetrical demographic expansion in Central Africa, meaning the specific pattern of male and female genetic contribution to the expansion didn't appear to be perfectly symmetrical. A finding the study's authors flagged directly as requiring further research across a wider range of Central African populations, including additional sampling from Nigeria, Niger, Chad, and Sudan to fully understand. This kind of sex-biased genetic signature, incoming migrant men and local resident women contributing differently to a population's genetic makeup, has since been documented repeatedly in other entirely separate historical contexts, studied by population geneticists, including the well-documented genetic legacy of Spanish colonization in Mexico and Norse settlement in Scotland's Northern Islands, and its appearance here in the earliest genetic research into the Bantu expansion suggested a genuinely similar underlying demographic dynamic might have shaped this African migration as well, though the specific mechanics of exactly how and why this asymmetry developed across such an enormous multi-millennia expansion remained at that point considerably less well understood than the broader fact of the migration itself. Follow-up research through the 2010s continued building on this foundation, using increasingly sophisticated genome-wide analysis rather than relying solely on the narrower Y chromosome and mitochondrial markers earlier studies had focused on. A 2014 study published in Proceedings of the Royal Society, B, directly traced what researchers identified as the specific West African genetic component associated with the expanding Bantu-speaking population, tracking its presence outward from the proposed Nigeria-Cameroon homeland across the rest of the African continent using supervised genetic clustering analysis. The results showed this specific West African genetic signature clearly and consistently present throughout the whole of sub-Saharan Africa, with its relative concentration only meaningfully diminishing in specific regions where other entirely separate linguistic groups had managed to persist alongside the expanding Bantu-Niger Kordofanian population, including Afro-Asiatic-speaking populations in northern Africa and Nilo-Saharan and Khoisan-speaking populations in eastern and southern Africa, respectively. This finding provided genuinely direct, quantifiable genetic confirmation that the Bantu expansion had involved real, substantial population movement, carrying a specific, traceable West African genetic signature across an enormous stretch of the continent, rather than representing a purely cultural or linguistic diffusion process with no significant underlying movement of people at all. A separate complementary study focused specifically on southern African populations, published around the same period, reached a broadly similar conclusion using its own independent genome-wide dataset drawn from 28 different populations. This research explicitly noted that Bantu languages are generally accepted to have originated in the area around the present-day border between Cameroon and Nigeria approximately 5,000 years before present, spreading outward from there to become the largest single linguistic branch anywhere on the African continent, with the demographic consequences of that spread reflected directly in the relatively high overall genetic homogeneity researchers have documented across most sub-Saharan African populations today, a homogenizing effect considerably stronger and more far-reaching than would be expected from a purely cultural transmission model with no significant accompanying migration. That same research team, examining genetic variation specifically along the southeastern edge of the Bantu expansion in Mozambique, directly rejected an alternative hypothesis some earlier researchers had proposed that a distinct non-Bantu genetic component detected in that specific region reflected extensive intermixing between incoming Bantu-speaking agriculturalists and resident hunter-gatherer communities already living there. Instead, the evidence pointed toward this genetic signal reflecting broader demographic dynamics tied directly to the mechanics of the Bantu dispersal itself, a genuinely important methodological distinction that helped refine exactly how researchers interpreted similar genetic signals found elsewhere across the wider expansion. Additional genetic research focused specifically on populations living along what researchers describe as the edge of the Bantu expansion in southwestern Angola added further useful detail to this picture by examining mitochondrial DNA, Y chromosome markers, and lactase persistence genetic variants together within the same specific regional population. This research confirmed the broader pattern already established elsewhere, that Bantu-associated mitochondrial haplogroups trace back to several different geographic source regions across Africa, reflecting the genuinely complex multidirectional nature of the wider expansion, while the paternal Y chromosome lineages remained considerably more uniform, dominated overwhelmingly by the same E3A haplogroup identified in earlier research, a pattern the study's authors interpreted as further evidence that this specific lineage had effectively overrun much of the pre-existing paternal genetic diversity present in the region before Bantu-speaking populations arrived. The same research also highlighted a persistent and genuinely significant gap in the broader scientific understanding of this expansion, noting directly that the country of Angola specifically had remained persistently underrepresented across nearly every major study of African genetic variation conducted up to that point, a limitation that meant researchers' overall picture of the Bantu expansion's southwestern reaches remained considerably less complete than their understanding of its eastern and southern trajectories. Despite this accumulating body of evidence, several genuinely important pieces of the puzzle remained unresolved heading into the 2020s, particularly concerning the specific pathways this expansion actually followed, and whether the population's genetic diversity had changed in the specific pattern researchers would typically expect from this kind of large-scale migratory expansion. This is precisely the gap the landmark 2023 study, published in the journal Nature, was specifically designed to close. The research team assembled what stands as, by a considerable margin, the most comprehensive genomic dataset ever compiled specifically to study this question, genotyping 1,763 total participants, including 1,126 confirmed Bantu speakers drawn from 147 distinct populations spread across 14 separate African countries, while simultaneously generating brand new whole genome sequences from 12 ancient individuals dated to the late Iron Age, recovered from archaeological sites in previously unsampled regions of the continent. The results confirmed, with a level of statistical rigor no earlier, smaller-scale study could have achieved, the broad interdisciplinary consensus that had already been building across linguistics, archaeology, and earlier genetic research. The initial spread of Bantu languages was, without meaningful ambiguity, a genuine demic expansion, meaning it was driven by the actual physical migration and settlement of real populations of people, not simply the cultural or linguistic diffusion of an idea, a farming technique, or language spreading between already established local populations with no significant movement of the people speaking it. The research confirmed that ancestral Bantu-speaking populations first migrated through the dense Congo rainforest before later spreading eastward into the African savanna regions, and the study's dating placed the beginning of this entire expansion at somewhere between 6,000 and 4,000 years ago, directly in line with the time frame linguistic and archaeological reconstruction had already independently proposed. But this landmark 2023 study also revealed something genuinely surprising, a finding that meaningfully complicated the simpler picture earlier research had painted, and one the study's authors themselves highlighted as one of the most significant results to emerge from the entire project. Most large-scale human migrations documented anywhere in the world tend to follow what researchers call a latitudinal pattern, moving primarily east-west along roughly similar lines of latitude, through regions sharing broadly comparable climate conditions and ecological environments. A pattern that makes basic practical sense since agricultural techniques, crops, and ways of life developed in one specific climate zone tend to transfer relatively easily to other regions sharing that same general climate. The Bantu expansion did the opposite. It followed a primarily longitudinal trajectory, moving north to south across an enormous range of latitude, and in doing so, it crossed through an extraordinarily diverse sequence of dramatically different climates and ecological biomes in succession, from the highlands of Cameroon, through the dense equatorial rainforests of the Congo Basin, out into the open savanna grasslands further east and south, and eventually into the genuinely arid semi-desert conditions of southwestern Africa. Successfully adapting agricultural practices, crops, and an entire way of life across this kind of extreme, rapidly shifting environmental gradient represents a genuinely remarkable feat of human adaptability, one researchers consider directly relevant to understanding why the expansion unfolded the specific way the genetic evidence shows it did. That environmental complexity connects directly to the single, most genuinely unexpected finding to emerge from the 2023 research. When population geneticists study a classic migratory expansion, in which a comparatively small group of people repeatedly splits off, moves into new, previously unsettled territory, and establishes a new founding population, they typically expect to observe what's called a serial founder effect, a specific, well-documented genetic pattern in which each successive wave of migrants moving further from the original point of origin carries progressively less overall genetic diversity than the population immediately before it, since each new founding group represents only a smaller, non-representative sample of the diversity present in the group it split off from. This exact pattern has been well documented in several other major human migrations studied by population geneticists, including the broader expansion of modern humans out of Africa entirely, where genetic diversity has been repeatedly shown to decline in a remarkably consistent, measurable way the further a given population's ancestors traveled from the African continent. The Bantu expansion did not show this expected pattern. Despite the genetic evidence clearly confirming this was a genuine large-scale migratory event carrying real people across an enormous stretch of the African continent, the typical serial founder effect, diversity steadily decreasing with increasing distance from the original Cameroon-Nigeria homeland, was notably absent from the data. The research team proposed a specific, genuinely compelling explanation for the surprising result. Rather than the expansion functioning as one single continuous wave of migration, steadily moving outward and gradually losing genetic diversity along the way, the Bantu-speaking migrants appear to have received substantial, ongoing genetic input from local populations already living in the various regions they moved into and settled, a process the researchers describe using the term spread over spread, essentially meaning later waves of Bantu-speaking migration moved through and mixed extensively with the descendants of earlier Bantu-speaking settlers who had already intermarried with local populations, rather than each new wave splitting cleanly and directly from the original, comparatively unmixed homeland population. In practical terms, this means the Bantu expansion wasn't simply one population physically replacing everyone it encountered as it moved. It was a genuinely two-way process. Incoming Bantu-speaking migrants repeatedly absorbing real, substantial genetic contributions from the populations already established in each new region they settled, even as their own language, culture, and a meaningful share of their own genetic ancestry continued spreading forward into the next region beyond that. The same 2023 research, along with earlier complementary findings from UCL researchers directly involved in the project, also revealed that the expansion's geography was considerably more complex than the standard, simplified textbook narrative of a single population moving cleanly south and east from Cameroon. The migration covered an extraordinary distance, more than 4,000 kilometers in less than 2,000 years, an extremely rapid pace for a pre-industrial agricultural expansion covering this much territory. But the genetic evidence also confirmed that migration occurred not only to the south and east of the Cameroon-Nigeria homeland, the direction most previous research had focused on almost exclusively, but genuinely westward as well, a direction earlier studies had left considerably less well documented and understood, and one that meaningfully complicates any attempt to describe the Bantu expansion as a single, simple arrow moving in one consistent direction across the map. Layered underneath all of this migratory movement, separate, dedicated genetic research has continued to reveal that the populations already living across the vast territory the Bantu expansion eventually crossed were never simply passive, uniform groups waiting to be absorbed or replaced. A specific study examining genome-wide data from small-scale forager communities and the last remaining speakers of the Kwadi branch of the Kui-Kwadi language family, living today in the Angolan Namib Desert, identified a genuinely deeply divergent ancestral component found exclusively among this specific population and closely related groups in adjacent parts of Namibia, a genetic signature entirely distinct from both the incoming Bantu-associated ancestry and the broader Khoisan-related ancestry documented further south and east. This finding demonstrates directly that the Bantu expansion, extraordinary and far-reaching as it genuinely was, did not simply erase every pre-existing population it encountered along its path. In certain specific regions, particularly those where challenging environmental conditions may have limited the intensity or completeness of subsequent contact and admixture, Genuinely distinct, older genetic lineages survived and remain directly detectable in living populations today, a real, physically documented reminder that the African continent's deeper genetic history did not simply end the moment Bantu-speaking farmers first arrived in a given region. The picture that emerges from combining this landmark 2023 genetic research with the considerable body of earlier archaeological and linguistic scholarship reveals the Bantu expansion as something genuinely more complex, and in its own way, more historically remarkable than either a simple story of straightforward population replacement or a simple story of pure cultural diffusion with no meaningful migration at all. It was, without real ambiguity, a genuine large-scale movement of actual people carrying real, traceable genetic ancestry that spread from a comparatively small homeland region into a territory that would eventually cover roughly a third of the entire African continent. But it was also, simultaneously, a genuinely absorptive process, one in which the migrating population repeatedly mixed with and incorporated real genetic contributions from the diverse populations already living across the wide range of different environments this expansion eventually passed through, from Central African rainforest hunter-gatherer communities to the deeply divergent pre-Bantu populations of what is now the Angolan Namib Desert, whose own unique genetic legacy survives detectably in local populations today, direct evidence that not every population encountered along the way was simply absorbed and erased without a genetic trace. This combination of genuine migration and genuine repeated absorption of local populations along the way helps explain something that had genuinely puzzled researchers studying the Bantu expansion for years before this landmark 2023 study finally provided a clear, evidence-based explanation. If this truly was one of the largest and most rapid population expansions documented anywhere in recorded human history, why didn't the genetic data show the same kind of steadily diminishing diversity researchers have consistently observed in other comparable large-scale migrations studied around the world? The answer, according to this most recent and comprehensive research, is that the Bantu expansion was never simply one population replacing everyone in its path as it moved. It was a considerably more dynamic, considerably more genuinely collaborative process than that, one in which language, agricultural technology, and a real substantial share of genetic ancestry all spread forward together, region by region, continuously renewed and enriched by contact with each new population. The expansion encountered along the way, rather than steadily thinning out and losing diversity the further it traveled from its original point of origin, put all of this accumulated research together, spanning more than 2 decades of increasingly sophisticated genetic investigation, from the earliest Y chromosome studies of the 2000s, confirming the dominance of a single paternal lineage across Bantu-speaking populations, through the detailed genome-wide clustering analyses of the 2010s, tracing the specific West African genetic signature across the continent, and the regional studies examining Mozambique, Angola, and the wider Southern African corridor, to the landmark 2023 study combining nearly 1,800 modern genomes with newly sequenced ancient DNA, and a genuinely coherent, scientifically rigorous picture of where the Bantu-speaking peoples of Africa actually came from finally comes into clear focus. The expansion began somewhere between 6,000 and 4,000 years ago, in a comparatively small region straddling the modern border between Cameroon and Nigeria, and unfolded as a genuine large-scale human migration carrying real people, not simply an idea or a set of tools, across more than 4,000 kilometers of extraordinarily varied African terrain in less time than most comparable agricultural expansions elsewhere in the world, required to cover a fraction of that same distance. Along the way, that migrating population repeatedly mixed with, absorbed genetic contributions from, and was in turn genetically enriched by the diverse array of populations already living across the Congo rainforest, the eastern savannas, and the arid southwest, while certain older, deeply divergent lineages, like the population identified in the Angolan Namib Desert, managed to survive that same process largely intact. The result was not a story of simple, steady dilution as researchers had originally expected, but a genuinely dynamic, continuously renewed migration that ultimately reshaped the linguistic, cultural, and genetic landscape of nearly a third of the entire African continent and left behind, in the DNA of roughly 350 million people alive today, the clearest and most detailed genetic record yet assembled of exactly how it actually happened.